Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. I'm just recording to update my pile of possibilities, my first pile of possibilities ever for Historathon 2025, the third quarter. I'm not actually a co-host, and this is only like the second quarter that I'm participating in. But my buddy John David really encouraged me to make my own pile of possibilities videos, so that's what I'm doing. And so that's for the years 1500 to 1820. And these are just some of the random books that I picked out that I thought would be interesting for this quarter, and in no particular order except for the first one. And that's because the first one I'm actually doing as a buddy read with John David. And so, yeah, it's really exciting. It's my first buddy read with a fellow booktuber, so I'm looking forward to it. And the book is The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller by Carlo Ginzburg. It's a really, really famous book. I'm sure many of you have already heard of it. It's a microhistory that was part of that trend of microhistories for a while, along with books like Robert Darnton's The Great Cat Massacre, and there was one other one, I don't remember which one. The Return of Martin Guerre. So there was kind of this, there were several of these books that were really popular for a while, in which you just take one specific smaller history, like a smaller story of a single person, and through that lens you explore something deeper about the culture. So with the Cheese and the Worms, I have here from the blurb of the book. It says, an incisive study of popular culture in the 16th century as seen through the eyes of one man, the miller known as Minocchio, who was accused of heresy during the Inquisition and sentenced to death. Carlo Ginzburg uses the trial records to illustrate the religious and social conflicts of the society Minocchio lived in. This is actually a book I've wanted to read since as long as I can remember, so I'm really excited to pick it up and to read it with John and see how that goes. I thought I would just provide a little excerpt with the books that I recommend, just in just so you can get a taste of the writing style, because I think with so much history, it's about the style. A lot of times, if you want something really just direct, straightforward, analytic, you want something a little more colorful. So I thought I'd provide a little excerpt. So the one for here is just the very first page. I have here on the 28th of September, 1583, Minocchio was denounced to the Holy Office. He was accused of having uttered heretical and most impious words about Christ. It wasn't a matter of an occasional blasphemy. Minocchio had actually tried to disseminate his opinions, bolstering them up by preaching and dogmatizing shamelessly, a fact that seriously aggravated his situation. His attempts at proselytization were attested to abundantly at the preliminary inquest, which opened a month later at Portogruaro and was continued at Concordia and in Montreal itself. He is always arguing with somebody about the faith just for the sake of arguing, even with the priest, Francesco Facetta testified to the vicar general. And another witness, Domenico Melchiori, added, he will argue with anyone, and when he started to debate with me, I said to him, I'm a shoemaker, and you're a miller, and you are not an educated man. So what's the use of talking about it? Such questions concerning the faith are supposed to be exalted and difficult, out of reach of millers and cobblers. To talk about them one needed knowledge, and the repositories of knowledge were, above all, the priests. But Pinocchio liked to say that he didn't believe the Holy Spirit governed the church, adding, priests want us under their thumb, just to keep us quiet, while they have a good time. As for him, he knew God better than they did. So when the village priest took him to the vicar general in Concordia so that he might be set straight, the priest warned him, these fancies of yours are heresies, and Minocchio promised not to meddle in such matters again, only to begin anew soon afterward. So I think the excerpt is really promising. It's a really lively style. It's a little bit funny, and I think it's really promising. So I'm really looking forward to reading that book. All the other books on the list are in completely random order, and that's because I don't know which one of these I'll be reading. I would really love to read them all if I could. So the next book I have on the list is entitled The Clockwork Universe by Edward Dolnick. And it mostly is sort of like it's a parade through the scientific revolution through its most prominent figures. So the blurb says something like, at the end of the 17th century, sickness was divine punishment, astronomy and astrology were indistinguishable, and the world's most brilliant, ambitious, and curious scientists were tormented by contradiction. They believed in angels, devils, and alchemy, yet also believed that the universe followed precise mathematical laws that were as intricate and perfectly regulated as the mechanisms of a great clock. And I just love books that are about that transition time, about the scientific revolution when things were really heating up and there was a great transition in thought. Some people might find the notion of a single scientific revolution a little bit controversial, but I still like reading books that sort of are premised on that. So for that one, I again just have the first page as the excerpt. So it begins, London, 1660. A stranger to the city who happened to see the parade of eager, chattering men disappearing into Thomas Gresham's mansion might have found himself at a loss. Who were these gentlemen in their powdered wigs, knee breeches, and linen cravats? It was too early in the day for a concert or a party, and this was hardly the setting for a bull baiting or a prize fight. With its shouting coachmen, reeking dunghills, and grit-choked air, London assaulted every sense, but these mysterious men seemed not to notice. Locals, then, for the giant metropolis left newcomers reeling. The men at Gresham's looked a bit like a theatre crowd, and with the Puritans out of power and Oliver Cromwell's head on a pole in front of Westminster Hall, theatres had opened their doors again. But in that case, where were the women? Perhaps the imposing building on the fashionable street concealed a gentleman's gambling club, a high-class brothel? Even a peek through a coal-grimed window might not have helped much. Amid the bustle, one man seemed to be spilling powder onto the tabletop and arranging it into a pattern. The man standing next to him held something between his fingers, small and dark and twitching. The world would eventually learn the identity of these mysterious men. They called themselves natural philosophers, and they had banded together to sort out the workings of everything from pigeons to planets. They shared little but curiosity. And that's just, pitched absolutely perfectly for me. I think that sounds super fun, and I'd love to get around to reading that. And I think anyone would have fun, even if you're not particularly interested in the scientific revolution. I think it just is a promising read. Sounds really fun. The next book I have in my pile is almost a contemporary piece of writing, but not quite. It's Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution. Again, a lot of you have probably heard of this. It's a little bit like picking up Gibbon or something. It's like the original and most influential text on the French Revolution. It was first published in 1837, so just a little bit outside of our period. But nevertheless, a foundational text that I've always wanted to read. It's quite long. It's a big undertaking, but I think from what I've heard, well worth it. And so my excerpt from it is, again, just the very beginning. I think he paints an interesting picture. So we've got chapter 1.1.1, Louis the Well-Beloved. President Henault, I'm not sure how to pronounce that one, forgive me, remarking on royal surnames of honor, how difficult it often is to ascertain not only why, but even when they were conferred, takes occasion in his sleek official way to make a philosophical reflection. The surname of Bien-Aimé, well-beloved, says he, which Louis XV bears, will not leave posterity in the same doubt. This prince, in the year 1744, while hastening from one end of his kingdom to the other, and suspending his conquests in Flanders that he might fly to the assistance of Alsace, was arrested at Metz by a malady which threatened to cut short his days. At the news of this, Paris, all in terror, seemed a city taken by storm. The churches resounded with supplications and groans. The prayers of priests and people were every moment interrupted by their sobs, and it was from an interest so dear and tender that this surname of Bien-Aimé fashioned itself, a title higher still than all the rest which this great prince has earned. So you can see that even though the writing is fairly antiquated, I think it still has a great energy to it, a great momentum, and you immediately just want to keep reading. At least I do. So that one seems pretty promising to me too. The next book I have on here actually is contemporary writing. It's Rousseau's Confessions, which is his autobiography. I actually would really love to read this because I had a chance to, some years ago, to visit the cottage where he stayed with his mistress in Chamfray, and it was just exactly as he described it. I mean, the gardens, the house, everything. And yes, it's possible that the gardens were tended, in imitation of his description rather than the other way around. But even just the way that the flight of stairs went upstairs and the shape of the house was completely and totally accurate. And he wrote his autobiography decades after he'd stayed there. So that was very cool. But I only had time to read excerpts at the time because I was traveling. So I'd love to come back and actually read the whole thing. I think Rousseau is a really interesting figure. Difficult to get along with. Maybe you wouldn't want to have to be friends in real life, but fascinating as a historical figure. And so he begins with typical Rousseauian verve. Here's the very beginning of the Confessions. It's really audacious. So he says, "Here is the only portrait of a man painted exactly according to nature and in all its truth, that exists and that will probably ever exist. Whoever you may be, whom my destiny or my trust has made the arbiter of the fate of this notebook, I entreat you by my misfortunes, by your innermost emotions, and in the name of the whole human species, not to destroy a unique and useful work which can serve as the first piece of comparison for the study of men, a study which certainly has not yet begun, and not to take away from the honor of my memory the only accurate monument to my character that has not been disfigured by my enemies. Finally, even if you yourself might be one of these implacable enemies, cease to be so towards my ashes, and do not sustain your cruel injustice up to the time when neither you nor I will be alive any longer, so that at least once you might nobly bear witness to yourself of having been generous and good when you could have been harmful and vindictive, if indeed evil intended for a man who has never done or wished to do any can bear the name of vengeance." I think that's an amazing opening to an autobiography, and it's tough. It's another one where it's sort of tough to start. It's tough to stop reading once you begin. I think that's pretty incredible, and I'd really, really like to be able to read this book this quarter. The next book I've got on here is not contemporary. It's a history book, and it's entitled "The Restless Republic: Britain Without a Crown" by Anna Keay. And this one is about the time after Charles I was executed. And I actually just don't know very much about this time period. So I just thought it'd be interesting to sort of brush up on this a little more. The blurb says, on a raw January afternoon, the Stuart king, Charles I, was executed for treason. Within weeks, the English monarchy had been abolished and the useless and dangerous House of Lords discarded. The people, it was announced, were now the sovereign force in the land. What this meant and where it would lead, no one knew. The Restless Republic is the story of the extraordinary decade that followed. It takes as its guides the people who lived through those years. Among them is Anna Trapnell, the daughter of a Deptford shipwright whose visions transfixed the nation. John Bradshaw, the Cheshire lawyer who found himself trying the king. Marshall Needham, the irrepressible newspaper man and puppet master of propaganda. Gerald Winstanley, who strove for a utopia of common ownership where no one went hungry. William Petty, the precocious scientist whose mapping of Ireland prefaced the dispossession of tens of thousands, and the indomitable Countess of Derby, who defended to the last the final royalist stronghold on the Isle of Man. I love history books that sort of take a single small slice of time and sort of use that as an excuse to sort of explore around the society, especially if I don't know a lot about it. I find that sort of an easier starting point with fewer events than sort of going through the kind of history book that's sort of a laundry list of events. I find a mix of those two the best way to sort of get into like a new historical period you don't know that much about. So for the excerpt, I've again got the first page. And if any of these books don't interest you, I have put timestamps down here, so you can just fast forward and you don't have to sit through the blurb and the excerpt and everything. I'm just providing this in case you're interested, but feel free to like fast forward if it's not your cup of tea. So the excerpt I've got here is the first page. It begins, "There could hardly have been a more apposite place in which to make the decision to execute Charles I than the Painted Chamber at Westminster. When the clouds broke during the numerous morning meetings here in January 1649, elongated lancets of sunlight streamed through the tall Gothic windows onto the matted floor and down the table where the men who brought the king to trial gathered. Created for Henry III 4 centuries before, this was once the great chamber of the medieval palace of Westminster. Outside a terrace of royal gardens lay between the massive stone building and the wide river Thames, while inside the high walls had once been painted with the vivid royal and biblical scenes to which it owed its name. This was the chamber where medieval kings had slept and dined, and where they had taken counsel. The building works had been completed just in time for the meeting of Henry III's Great Council of January 1237. Here the Plantagenet king had secured agreement to the taxes he wished to levy by promising various concessions to his subjects. During this, the first gathering in English history to be called a parliament, he had pledged to reissue the famous undertaking which his father King John had signed, and then repudiated, the Magna Carta. With it was established the principle that everybody, even the king, was subject to the law. So that promises to be pretty interesting, very educational for me. It's a period of time I think I've neglected by accident, so I'd really like to look into that. The next book I've got here is The Crisis of the European Mind, 1680 to 1750 by Paul Hazard. And this is a pretty well-regarded history of Western thought that kind of covers the transition from sort of neoclassical thought, which was very conservative and kind of static, to Enlightenment thought, which was much more open and dynamic. And Hazard himself was an interesting figure. He was teaching at Columbia when the Nazis took over in France, and he voluntarily returned to France to teach in France and was eventually awarded the rectorship at the University of Paris, which he was prevented from taking up because of the Nazis. So he remained in Paris for the rest of the war completely voluntarily. He returned from America. I thought that was sort of interesting. From the blurb, we've got Hazard shows how travelers' tales and archaeological investigation widen European awareness and acceptance of cultural difference, how the radical rationalism of Spinoza and Richard Simon's new historical exegesis of the Bible called into question the revealed truths of religion, how the Huguenot Pierre Bayle's critical dictionary of ideas paved the way for Voltaire and the Enlightenment, even as the empiricism of Locke encouraged a new attention to sensory experience that led to Rousseau and Romanticism. Hazard's range of knowledge is vast, and whether the subject is operas, excavations, or scientific experiments, his brilliant style and powers of description bring to life the thinkers who thought up the modern world. So, kind of like a basic history of ideas, which I always like. So, the excerpt, I believe, is also the first page. Not all of the excerpts I chose are from the first page, but I tried to choose things that were in the first couple of pages so that you can kind of see how we begin and how we get the momentum going. So we start with the ferment begins. To preserve existing conditions, to keep things firm and steady, to avoid any change that might disturb an equilibrium so miraculously attained, such was the paramount preoccupation of the classical age. There was peril in those questionings that vexed the restless spirit, and not only peril, but folly to boot. For let a man rush off to the utmost limits of the globe, what will he find there but what he brings, that is to say, himself? And even if he found anything else, would he not have wasted his mental and spiritual riches in the effort? Far better that he should concentrate his powers and focus them on those eternal questions which are certainly not to be solved by aimlessly flitting about from place to place. Seneca has it that the hallmark of a well-regulated mind is that it can call a halt when it will, and dwell at peace within itself, while Pascal lays it down that all the ills that afflict a man proceed from one sole cause, namely that he has not learned to sit quietly and contentedly in a room. I think it sounds really interesting, so I'd really like to read that one. And the next book I've got here is the Letters on England by Voltaire. So these are fictional letters that Voltaire wrote while he was in exile in England, and they're sort of his observations of England. They're very, very famous. But I've never had a chance to read them except for a couple at the very beginning. And so they cover, the blurb talks about, well, the edition I was looking at talks about how it covers topics like religious tolerance, freedom of speech, the separation of powers. So it's kind of a work of, as always with Voltaire, it's kind of a work of political thought. And so I remember reading a letter in which he attends a Quaker meeting, and I thought it was pretty cool. So I've got that letter here. So it's actually the second letter in the book. And so he's just had dinner with a Quaker man, and now he's going to the meeting house. So letter 2 on the Quakers. He says, "Such roughly was the conversation I had with this remarkable man." That's the dinner he had with the Quaker minister. "But I was still more surprised when on the following Sunday he took me to the Quaker meeting. They have several meeting houses in London, and the one I went to is near the famous pillar they call the Monument. They were already assembled when I went in with my guide. There were about 400 men in the church and 300 women. The women hid their faces behind their fans. The men were wearing their broad hats. All were seated. All were profoundly silent. I went through the midst of them without a single one looking up at me. This silence lasted a quarter of an hour. Eventually one of them rose, doffed his hat, and after making a few faces and fetching a few sighs, he recited, half through his mouth and half through his nose, a rigmarole taken from the Gospels, or so he believed, of which neither he nor anyone else understood a word. When this contortionist had finished his fine monologue, and the assembly had broken up, edified and quite baffled, I asked my friend why the wiser among them put up with such silliness. 'We have to tolerate it,' he said, 'because we cannot tell whether a man who rises to speak will be inspired by the Spirit or by folly. When in doubt, we listen patiently to it all, and even let women speak. 2 or 3 of our devout women often become inspired at the same time. And then there is a fine old rumpus in the house of the Lord.'" Well, they even let the women speak. How radical. So I think those the letters should be pretty fun to read too, as not only as a stranger in a strange land that that Voltaire is in England, but as we modern 21st century people are looking back at this time period in England. So I look forward to reading that at some point, even if I don't read it during this quarter. The next book I have is a book I only recently discovered, and it's called The Ruin of All Witches by Malcolm Gaskell. And I have to admit, my interest in this one is less than academic. I'm interested in it because it's about Springfield, Massachusetts, which is like right here in my backyard. So it's kind of local history for me. And this one is about a witch hunt that occurred in Springfield, Massachusetts in the 1650s. And I thought it was interesting too because it's, less famous than the witch hunts that happened in Salem. So this immediately caught my eye when I saw it. And the blurb says, in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1651, peculiar things begin to happen. Precious food spoils, livestock ails, property vanishes, and people suffer convulsions as if possessed by demons. A woman is seen wading through the swamp like a lost soul. Disturbing dreams and visions proliferate. Children sicken and die. As tensions rise, rumors spread of witches and heretics, and the community becomes tangled in a web of distrust, resentment, and denunciation. The finger of suspicion soon falls on a young couple with 2 small children, the prickly brickmaker Hugh Parsons and his troubled wife Mary. So in a way, this is kind of like a type of microhistory, I guess you could say, because it's not looking at the wider world, but through looking at this witch hunt, the book promises to look at what life was like in this kind of frontier of New England at the time, and that really interests me too, because I don't know all that much about the time period before the American founding, so I'm sort of interested in that. For a taste of the style, here's a short excerpt. It begins, chapter 1, A Voice That Said Death. Once, beside a great river at the edge of a forest, there stood a small town. Time has erased its every trace, but we can imagine it, quiet and still, settled under a pall of late winter darkness. A man is hurrying home along the main street. To his left, a trickling brook and a fathomless bank of trees. To his right, a curve of clapboard houses with steep roofs and leaded windows. Down the narrow lanes between homesteads, he glimpses the moonlit river in spate from the thaw. The air is ice-sharp, tinged with smoke and resin. The only sounds the rush of water, the muffled bellows of cattle, and the distant cry of a wolf. It feels like the edge of the world, and to those who have settled here, it is. Beyond the mountains to the west lie uncharted lands, as mysterious as the heavens, inhabited by people of an unknown, perhaps hostile disposition. It is February 1651. The man's name is Jonathan Taylor, and he has had an unsettling day, which is not over yet. So I like the style of this one. It feels very novelistic and really engrossing from the first moment. And I think it should be a fun history of sort of a local history of where I am. And so I think that should be pretty interesting. The last book I have in my pile of possibilities, I realized I felt that my selections were a little bit narrow. So I did pick up, I've always been interested in China and China's sort of the late sort of time in China when there was sort of a transition from China being the center of the world away from China. That's always sort of interested me. So I have a book here called The Confusions of Pleasure, Commerce and Culture in Ming China by Timothy Brook. The blurb just talks about, it says, the confusions of pleasure marks a significant departure from the conventional ways in which Chinese history has been written. Rather than recounting the Ming Dynasty in a series of political events and philosophical achievements, it narrates this longue durée in terms of the habits and strains of everyday life. Peppered with stories of real people and their negotiations of a rapidly changing world, this book provides a new way of seeing the Ming Dynasty that not only contributes to the scholarly understanding of the period, but also provides an entertaining and accessible introduction to Chinese history for anyone. It seems to cover the time period where there was a departure from China being the preeminent power in the world over to the West. And I think that's sort of interesting. I just find that sort of that time period interesting. I find these periods of transition interesting. And so for the excerpt, we've got the Ming Dynasty began with the peace of the winter season, or so our late Ming author, we'll leave him nameless for the moment, thought, as he stood in the opening decade of the 17th century and looked all the way back to the 14th. The first half of the dynasty seemed to him the very picture of sensible order and settled life. Every family was self-sufficient, he was sure, with a house to live in, land to cultivate, hills from which to cut firewood, gardens in which to grow vegetables. Taxes were collected without harassment, and bandits did not appear. Marriages were arranged at the proper times, and the villages were secure. Men and women followed the time-honored division of household tasks, men in the fields and women at home weaving. Deception did not sprout, and litigation did not arise. All as it should be. And so we see that we're set up for maybe not a fall, but a great transition. And so I always find that sort of thing really fascinating. I've got two honorable mentions I'll just mention really quick in case you're interested. I won't do a whole rundown on them. One is called Falling Upwards, How We Took to the Air by Richard Holmes, and that's a book about ballooning, how ballooning began. And I enjoyed, the reason I was interested in this book is because I enjoyed another of his books called The Age of Wonder a long time ago, and he's just a really fun history of science writer. I was also very surprised that this had somehow been made into some kind of TV show. I don't think I've ever heard of a nonfiction book that's not a biography being made into a TV show, so I'd be interested to see what that would even be. But I thought The History of Ballooning sounds really fun. The reason I didn't choose it is because it starts in the correct period, but most of the book is really too late. It sort of covers mostly the latter half of the 19th century, so I didn't think it would quite fit into quarter three. But I just found it so fun, I wanted to mention it. And the last one is a book entitled Descartes' Metaphysical Physics by Daniel Garber. And it's just, it just discusses Descartes' treatment of science, so of natural philosophy. It says here accounts of matter and motion, atoms, vacua, and the laws that matter in motion must obey. And I have to say, I've always found Descartes' philosophy of science really interesting and strange. So he believed in the plenum, the idea that nature abhors a vacuum. So his idea of what space had to be was pretty wacky. So he had this idea that there were all these sort of spinning vortices, and that's how gravity worked. And it was a really interesting, strange way of conceiving of the universe and how it worked. It wasn't very precise, but I've always thought it was interesting. I've always found his stuff on primary and secondary qualities interesting, stuff on optics and so on. The reason I didn't include this one is because it felt a little bit more like philosophy than it did history. It's not clear to me how much it actually is an account, like a historical account, rather than just a reconstruction of what Descartes said. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to read it, even though I don't think it completely fits into quarter 3 of Historathon. But if you've stuck with me for this long, thank you. That was my first pile of possibilities. I hope maybe you've found a book or two that you thought was interesting. I'll definitely be looking around at other people's piles of possibilities to see what else people are reading and looking at. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great quarter 3. I hope you're relatively cool. It's blisteringly hot here. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.